Let's have a look at the state of the sodium and potassium channels through the various phases of the action potential. Let's start with the sodium channels. Initially, they are closed. Once the membrane is depolarized to the threshold potential of sodium channels opening, they begin to open, and they open during the whole depolarization phase. Once they have opened, they inactivate after a certain amount of time. So just before the peak, they begin to inactivate, and they will inactivate during the repolarization phase. And once the membrane is back to a potential below the threshold potential, so once the membrane is below here, the channels begin to close. So we see here that the sodium current underlies the depolarization phase of the sodium action potential. Now, the repolarization phase is due to what? Is due to first the inactivation of the sodium channels, because here the sodium current decreases a lot because the pore of the channel is closed, channels inactivate. And there is also the action of the potassium current. So potassium channels at the beginning, because they are also voltage-gated channels, they are closed. Once the threshold is attained, the channels open. They open with a delay, which is extremely important, and they are open essentially during the repolarization phase. Why the opening of potassium current repolarizes the membrane? Because first you have the entry of sodium ions, and then you have the exit of potassium ions. So you gain positive charges inside of the membrane at first, and then you lose positive charges, so you go back to the basal membrane potential. And then here you have a phase that we did not speak about before, which is called after spike hyperpolarization. Spike is the action potential because it's sudden, we call it like a spike. After spike, hyperpolarization. What is it? It's a polarization of the membrane at very negative potentials because the potassium channels close, but not quickly. They close with a delay. So you see here that the delay of activation of potassium channels is very important because let's suppose that the two channels open at the same time. At that moment, you will have the same amount going in, the same amount of positive charges going out, and so you will have no depolarization at all, no signal. So it's very important that there is a delay between the two, and that the potassium goes out, exits after the sodium entered. Where is the action potential initiated? Is it initiated in the soma or at the beginning of the axon, what we call the initial segment? It can be initiated in dendrites because most of the dendrites do not have in their membrane sodium channels. To address this question, the researchers recorded in the soma, in the same neuron, they recorded from the soma here and from the axon initial segment, in different types of neurons, to be sure that it was not due to the type of neuron they were studying. Each time they did that, they saw that the delay between the step they give to the membrane and the action potential is shorter at the axon initial segment. So it means that the action potential is initiated at the axon initial segment. How come? This is because there are a lot of sodium channels in the membrane of the action initial segment, and these sodium channels have a threshold potential of opening which is lower. It means that other channels, the channels in the soma, what do I mean? I mean that, for example, if in the soma they open at minus 50, in the initial segment they would open at minus 52 or 55 millivolts. So they open for depolarization that is not so strong, so they open first. The action potential is initiated at the axon initial segment, and then it propagates to the soma where you can record it. That's why the delay between the step and the action potential is longer in the soma. For example, here it's the initial segment. In the soma, it would be longer. This is because the delay of backpropagation of the action potential. Of course, it propagates also towards the axon terminals, and this is, of course, very important because this is the role of the action potential, is to trigger the release of neurotransmitter. And we will see now how it propagates. How does the membrane of the initial segment get depolarized? It's because of the activity of synapses that you see here. We see excitatory and inhibitory synapses. When excitatory synapses are very active, it depolarizes the membrane of the soma, and then it depolarizes the membrane of the initial segment. And if the depolarization is strong enough, then it opens the first sodium channels here in the initial segment. So just to remind you, once the action potential is initiated, it backpropagates to the soma. Then it stops here because there are no sodium channels in the dendrites in most of the neurons. And it propagates also towards the axon terminals, and this is very important because this is the role of the action potential to trigger the release of neurotransmitter. How does the action potential propagate along the axon? If we record in the axon initial segment here at T0, we record at the first node of Ranvier here at T1, and we record at the second node of Ranvier here at T2. We record an action potential of the same amplitude, exactly the same amplitude. How come? It's because the action potential is regenerated at each node of Ranvier. Why? Mostly because here you have what we call a myelin sheath. Most of the axons are wrapped up with a myelin sheath, which is made up by glial cells and contains a lot of lipids. So it acts like an insulator, and it prevents current from leaking out of the axon. So when you have an insulator, of course, the propagation is much better. And also, it is recreated at each node of Ranvier because here you have a lot of sodium channels, and they are reopened, they are open, in fact, by the depolarization coming downwards. And this is the same down to the axon terminals. It propagates from node of Ranvier to the following node of Ranvier. This myelin sheath is around 0.2 to 2 millimeters long. And if we have a propagation of 20 meters per second, it means that the time here between the two nodes is around 100 microseconds. How does it exactly work? We will see that on the next slide. Let's have a look at the action potential propagation from the axon initial segment down the axon from one node of Ranvier to the next. There are many sodium channels at the axon initial segment and at the node of Ranvier to allow the propagation of the action potentials. Let's imagine that the action potential is initiated at the axon initial segment. We know that the action potential is initiated at the axon initial segment here. You will see here, you see that the sodium channels are open. So sodium are going to cross the membrane and to go in. See, these incoming positive charges will then open the sodium channels at the first node of Ranvier. Let's have a look. You see here the sodium ions that cross the membrane through the open sodium channels here, and that go out as potassium ions through potassium channels that are always open. Now, here, the sodium channels are inactivated, and these sodium channels here open. And the charges are going up and down through potassium channels. The sodium channels at the axon initial segment are here, you see, inactivated. And those at the first node of Ranvier are open, and those at the second node of Ranvier are closed. It's very important that these sodium channels inactivate, because otherwise the action potential could be propagated backwards. Here it's impossible because these sodium channels are like closed, so there is no sodium current here. So the charges here that go in, they can go out, but they cannot open these channels. Now they go this way, and they can open the channels of the second node of Ranvier that are closed. And like this, from each node of Ranvier, the action potential is regenerated and propagates without attenuation of its amplitude. The action potential is an all or none signal, because either the sodium channels are open or they are not. They open one after another, because every time one opens, sodium ions come in, and that depolarizes the membrane, and this depolarization makes even more sodium channels open, because these channels are voltage gated. They are sensitive to the depolarization. So, they open extremely rapidly one after another. The action potential propagates with the same amplitude, because it is recreated at every node of Ranvier. It is referred to as a sodium action potential because its depolarization phase only depends on sodium current. It starts at the initial segment because there is a great concentration of sodium channels with an opening threshold that is lower than in other parts of the neuron, such as the soma. It propagates in the axon and not in the dendrites, because in the great majority of neurons, dendrites have almost no sodium channels. So once started in the initial segment, the action potential will propagate to the soma and stop there. In the other direction, it will travel down the axon and the axon collaterals all the way to the axon terminals. What is its role? It causes the fusion of vesicles containing neurotransmitters to the membrane in the axon terminals and the release of neurotransmitters. Therefore, the essential part played by the action potential is to bring about synaptic transmission. This is what we are going to see in the next chapter.